This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello and welcome to the Sunday Lunchtime Show. Thank you for joining me. Today I will be talking about teaching and learning under difficult circumstances.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Sunday Lunchtime Show, everyone. I'm Graham Stanley, speaking to you live from Mexico City. As I mentioned earlier on today's show, I'll be talking about teaching and learning under difficult circumstances. I don't have a guest today, so if you are listening in live and would like to join me to have a chat about any of the things I am talking about, or if you have any knowledge or experience of teaching and learning under difficult circumstances, then I'd love to hear from you. Please join us in the studio, and I can bring you in as a speaker. And I will be mainly talking about the teaching of English as another language, but much of what I will talk about is appropriate, of course, to other subjects too. And of course, there are exceptionally difficult circumstances that unfortunately some teachers and learners find themselves in. This may be due to natural disasters or because they live in a conflict zone. Rather than this type of difficult circumstance, I'll be focusing more on the usual difficult circumstances that teachers and learners may find are part of their expected educational context. And depending on which part of the world you teach in, this might include large class sizes, demotivated students, a lack of resources, social problems, etc. I have a few case studies, examples that I've come across previously to share with you. And of course, when it comes to teaching English or teaching a language, multiple language levels in the same class is a particular challenge. And I'll be talking about practical activities for teachers, how to deal with some of these things in the second half of the show, after I've talked about some of the more kind of bigger picture things from a national or regional perspective. And of course, there are circumstances which I will be talking about as well when no teachers are available. How do you provide access in that situation? I'll be talking about these challenges after the Teachers Talk Radio News.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
According to Schools Week, all 3 of Eton College's proposed flagship Elite Sixth Forms, run in partnership with Star Academies, which were to level up left-behind areas, are being reviewed by the government. All 3 of the 16 to 19 schools due to open in Dudley, Teesside and Oldham are part of a review of whether 44 planned mainstream free schools offer value for money. The government has so far refused to confirm which of the projects are affected. The 3 schools were originally given the green light last summer and were described as high-quality, academic-focused 16 to 19 free schools in education investment areas. The plans were part of the former government's Levelling Up white paper. An Eton Star Partnership spokesperson said, "The review does not come as a huge surprise given the current fiscal situation, and we intend to fully engage with this process," but that it remained fully committed to the plans, saying it would transform the lives of many young people across the country. The Department for Education said assessments will be based on whether the proposed schools meet a need for places in the area, if they have any impact on existing local providers, and whether the schools would provide a distinctive curriculum. In The Guardian, a report covers comments by Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson about schools' focus on well-being. Speaking at the CST conference, she suggested that schools can respond to declining attendance and an increase in numbers of pupils with SEND by improving the sense of belonging. She said, "Exam results open important doors to opportunity for young people. They will continue to be the anchor of our education system. But A-stars alone do not set young people up for a healthy and happy life. And where previous governments have had tunnel vision, we will widen our ambition." This speech came in the context of a wide-ranging curriculum and assessment review, as well as plans for a Children's Wellbeing Bill to be published next year. Phillipson went on to say that well-being and belonging hold the key. If we want to tackle the epidemic of school absence, children need to feel like they belong in school. She also argued that a sole focus on achieving is doomed to fail, because if we fall into that trap of chasing a narrow shade of standards, then children with SEND get swept to the side and attendance crashes. The curriculum review is expected to encourage a broader curriculum to be taught in schools, including music, art, sport and drama, as well as vocational subjects. FE Week reports on information from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which suggests government should replace GCSE maths resits with a new foundation level course, after warning the bar is unachievably high for some students to pass the GCSE. In the report, it says research found England's share of young people studying maths up to the age of 18 is among the lowest in the OECD's 38 member countries, in part due to a limited range of options for continuing the subject in post-16 settings. The study found that at least half of students study maths to 18 across OECD member countries, compared with just 16.5% of students in England, and a third of those were those who did not have a grade 4 at GCSE. The report suggests that the breadth and depth of maths GCSE is comparable to other programmes across the OECD, but that England students are younger when they take the course and have just 2 years to cover content compared to 4 in other countries. The report finally recommended that policymakers review and consider a foundation-level course for those who do not achieve a grade 4 at GCSE, to ensure that they can continue their core mathematical knowledge and skills, replacing the GCSE resit altogether. Finally, the BBC reports that a 17-year-old Chinese maths prodigy actually cheated in a maths contest, according to its organisers. The student made headlines in June when she came 12th in the qualifiers for the contest run by the e-commerce company Alibaba. She was the first finalist since 2018 to have come from a vocational school, as the vast majority of past finalists have come from elite universities. However, competition organisers said the student had violated competition rules by receiving help from her teacher, who was also a contestant. The story has prompted debate about whether China's education system does enough to support gifted students in less academic pathways, as well as the pressures all students and teachers face. Full details can be found on the BBC News Asia webpage. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
And welcome back, everyone. Many of the world's population, including children, live in difficult circumstances, and it is severely affecting education. According to a recent report by UNESCO, 250 million children and young people worldwide are not in school, and young women and girls are particularly excluded from learning. All young people, of course, deserve opportunities for quality education, and this exclusion is a major barrier to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically 4, 5, and 10. Now, Sustainable Development Goal 4, or SDG 4, as its shortened version is known as, is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. SDG 5 is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, and SDG 10, reducing inequalities within and among countries. So I'm going to start today by looking at this macro situation a little bit, then how policymakers in some countries and regions try to deal with problems such as shortages of teachers, and but then I will also be talking about the difficult circumstances that some teachers and learners face within their own schools and within their own particular classrooms. And as I said earlier, looking at some of the things that teachers can do to kind of compensate or to cope with some of these difficult circumstances. Now, when I use the term difficult circumstances, I think in the show, at least, I'll be broadly referring to one of two things. On the one hand, I'll use it to describe the situation that large numbers of people find themselves in because of the large-scale educational system context, for example. But however, I'll also be using the term to describe a situation that many individual teachers and learners find themselves in as well. This is less drastic, of course, than total exclusion, but nonetheless, there are many teachers who find themselves having to deal with, shall we say, a less than ideal situation when teaching in the classroom. So, let's start by looking at large-scale difficult circumstances, the problems that countries or regions face, or the macro point of view, if you like. And I want to begin with a case study, a solution of a particular problem that took place that started, if you like, some years ago in mainland China. And this is something that is related to the lack of teachers or the lack of resources for learning English that existed back then, that still exists to a certain extent. And it also deals with this idea of what can you do if you have an extremely large class. So large class sizes is a problem for many teachers. Is something that you find all over the world in many educational contexts. But what does a large class actually mean? When is a class a large class? Is it 30 students? Could you consider 30 students being a large class? 40, 50, 60, 100? What about a football stadium full of students? Is that even possible? Well, you might be listening to this and thinking, no, that would be impossible to teach. But I think after you've heard what I'm going to say, you'll realize that there are ways of even teaching thousands of students together. Although whether you can actually call it teaching, I'm not so sure. But I'll leave that for you to decide. And remember, I don't have a guest today, so I would love if you're listening in live and would like to join me to talk about anything related to difficult circumstances, teaching and learning, then I'd love to hear from you. Please join me in the studio, and you can find out how to do that if you're listening and don't know by going to the website ttradio.org, and you will find information about how to join live there. So back to this idea of large class sizes and this solution that was proposed many years ago. So when people don't have access to enough teachers, or provision in the formal education system is lacking, then that's when you can find innovative solutions emerging. And one example is this way of providing very cheap instruction of English to large numbers of people that was started some time ago and is still happening now, as far as I'm aware. And this is something that is often referred to as crazy English. This method of teaching English was devised in mainland China by someone called Li Yang, yes. Crazy English is the brand name that is used for this method that I'm about to describe of teaching the language. Now, believing the traditional way of teaching English to be ineffective, Crazy English has a focus on practicing English orally and is encapsulated in the slogan, which I imagine is a literal translation, by shouting out loud, you learn. It has, because of this, gained disapproval in some quarters, as it is anything but modest or restrained. And it also has at its heart a very traditional model of learning a language or practicing a language that owes a lot to recitation and repetition. And I'll explain more very, very shortly. So I remember some time ago talking to a teacher trainer once about Crazy English. She had lived and worked in mainland China, and she said she first came across this very popular movement when she was woken up one night by the shouting of English phrases. And at first she thought she was dreaming, but then she realized that no, there was somebody outside of her apartment that were a group of people that were shouting out phrases, random phrases in English. And she realized that a group of Chinese crazy English students had gathered on a street corner late at night near where she lived to do their homework. And this homework consisted of them shouting out a series of English phrases to each other. The method isn't new. This started in the 1990s when there was an explosion in the demand for learning English, but not the resources for people to do so in China. And Yi Lang was one of those people who found it difficult to speak English, by all accounts. Somehow he stumbled upon the idea of shouting out passages he needed to learn for an exam, and he found that this made him more confident about speaking in English. And he continued to do this, and after he passed the exam, some 4 months later, I think, he felt he had found a way of learning the language that could benefit others too. Now, Yang worked afterwards as an electrical engineer, but he continued with his English, and he started in his free time using this new method of teaching English as a shouted language. And in 1994, he was confident enough that this was something that many more people would be interested in, to start his own company to promote this technique, which he called Crazy English. And after gaining in popularity, Li Yang was at some point asked to try out this method to teach to a crowd of around 5,000 people, I think by a school. And shortly after, this approach started to become popular. The popularity and originality, I think, of this method of teaching English was cemented when a documentary was made in around, I think it was 1999. And if you're interested in actually seeing this approach to the teaching of English in action, there are lots of clips on YouTube. All you have to do is go and search for Crazy English, and you'll see examples of Yi Lang addressing huge crowds in football stadiums, and you'll see the method in action. So this method snowballed after the documentary was made and released, with more than 20 million people signing up for a course. 20 million people. And Li Yang also gained official recognition and was asked to teach in some very unusual circumstances, not only in football stadiums in front of crowds of thousands of people, but on occasion to teach soldiers on the Great Wall of China and at intensive camps to prepare for the 2008 Olympics. From what I can tell, the method is still very popular and is a multi-million-pound business, with Li Yang still the director and principal teacher of it. I am not sure that it has spread outside of China. I think it's a very particular method developed for very particular culture and people, and it has become popular there. I'm not sure it is something that I'm not aware of, at least. That is something that has been taken elsewhere. If you know different, come and join me. Ask to be a guest on the show, and we can have a chat about it. Or if you know something about this, or if you have any other examples of how teachers or how teaching is provided, not just English, but any subject really, to large groups of people, how teachers and educational systems deal with these difficult circumstances, such as the lack of teachers or others, then please come and join me if you're listening live, and we can talk about it. So, what is this method? Well, the methodology basically consists of a teacher, usually on a stage, if it's in a very big situation with thousands of people, as I mentioned before, in a football stadium or a sports stadium, for example. It usually consists of one teacher on stage with a microphone, and they are, at least from what I can tell, screaming popular random English phrases out to the masses rapidly, who are encouraged to shout back. It doesn't have a focus on grammar, on vocabulary or writing. It focuses instead on speaking through repetition, with a lot of gesticulating being used, as far as I can tell. And Li Yang or the other teachers shout out the words and phrases and ask their students to repeat them out loud and shout back. It's based on trying to develop confidence in speaking a foreign language, which is something that a lot of people have difficulty with. One of the things that holds a lot of language learners back is this idea of being shy or not confident enough to actually use the language. And this is meant to increase that confidence in speaking. And as I said, it's all about learning through repetition. As I mentioned earlier as well, after class, the students are encouraged to go to public places. So they are asked to go out to street corners, behind buildings, on rooftops, to meet each other and to shout out the English phrases and words that they have just learned. And this is meant to help the students gain in confidence, and presumably it lowers the effective filter that many language learners have, which prevents them from progressing in a language. Is it effective? Well, I'd love to know more. Who knows? But it does seem to be a very popular method in China, and still. So it's been going on for years. And for some people, it is probably their only contact with the language. And given its popularity, it must be working to some extent. Like any way of learning a language, I think people learn languages despite the circumstances. If you're that motivated to learn a language and you try hard enough and put in the time, you will learn. How well you learn is another question. But this does seem to have something and seems to work for the people who are using it. I would love to meet and to speak to someone who has actually learnt English through this method, just to have that experience of finding out how much and how well they know, especially as it does seem to not focus or not at all address things such as grammar or vocabulary or writing or reading, etc. So I think one of the reasons why it wasn't designed to include that was because it was felt that through the traditional educational system, the Chinese students were getting enough of that formal language learning, language teaching. So they were learning how to start to write and to read in English, but they weren't getting any instruction or any practice speaking, and this was holding them back. And this is why this methodology was developed. Li Yang has taught English now to millions of students, and he appears in stadiums, sometimes to groups of 10,000 students or more. And to think, some of us complain about teaching large classes, meaning 30, etc. I do remember teaching a class of around 40 students who were studying catering, and it was their first year at a vocational school, learning how to become waiting staff and chefs, or working in kitchens, etc. They were all very much practically oriented, not very interested in academic work at all, and they treated the English classes as something that wasn't particularly of interest to them, certainly in the first year. And it was, how do I say, quite chaotic. I think much of my time was trying to get them to focus, and I found it very difficult to get much of anything actually done, and they were all beginners as well. So that was my experience of teaching a large class, and I thought that was difficult with 40 students. What I think was interesting is that by the time they were in the third year, it became a lot easier to do that, because what they learned in the kitchen was a lot of, I think, the kitchen management skills of the teachers who were teaching the catering certainly had an effect in the language classroom as well, and the students ended up being a lot better behaved as they learned the discipline of working in a kitchen. And this sort of, they were being trained for kitchens that were quite high quality, I think. Anyway, I digress. If you're listening live and would like to call in to talk about any aspect of teaching under difficult circumstances, I don't have a guest today, so please do so. Please come in and request to join me, and I can add you as a speaker, and we can have a chat about any of this. If you have any experience of crazy English, I would love to hear from you, or any other tips or suggestions for teaching under difficult circumstances. Some of the things I mentioned previously, which I'll be going on to talk about and give some suggestions for teachers. I would love to hear from you too. Please do come in and join me.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Welcome back. Now, sticking with the macro point of view, another problem countries often face is a lack of teachers. And large class sizes and the problems that go with them are not only a problem in China, of course. There are problems all over the world. I'm going to look now at a solution that was trying to take educational technology or technology to try to deal with a lack of teachers who were able to give general educational classes in Ethiopia. Now, in Ethiopia, where the typical primary and secondary school class sizes apparently are from 55 to 100, so quite large, they adopted a method called plasma teaching in the early 2000s. This was an interesting example of trying to think of how the country could use new technology to be able to solve a particular problem and give access to education to students, to schools, where it was otherwise very difficult for them to do so because there weren't any teachers equipped to be able to give the classes. It was meant to be part of an educational reform for students in grades 9 to 10. And this particular solution involved the installation of a plasma TV in the classroom. And the idea was that the students and teachers were going to watch and listen to a lesson transmitted live by satellite or recorded previously by a teacher who's based in South Africa, where there were enough teachers to be able to do this. And partly the reason for doing this is because many of the Ethiopian teachers were not sufficiently qualified or they lacked teacher training. And local teachers were meant to support the TV lesson by giving an introduction and conducting post-viewing activities, facilitating a discussion, for example, and providing a conclusion or even substituting if the power went out. It's an interesting solution, isn't it? It's always something that I've heard over the years that that I think we're going to see more of with the advent of AI as well. That this idea of there being a shortage of teachers, not being enough qualified, experienced teachers to be able to provide instruction, education within schools in a particular area or within a country. It's one of the biggest problems that is faced at the moment, I think, by educational systems. And part of the reason why an educational system faces this, it's complex, isn't it? But we all know, I think, of the problems it is in recruiting teachers. It's a stressful job. It seems to becoming more stressful and taking up more time and requiring more dedication and more from, in general, from the people who do the job as time goes on. And this is why we see a lot of teachers leaving the profession in a lot of countries, which is kind of a problem if you need to provide high quality education for students. What do you do? How do you cope with that? How do you actually fix that? Well, I think ultimately the long-term solution has to look at why a country, an educational system, is not able to attract enough teachers, and that could be down to the way that teachers are, the conditions, the terms and conditions, of course. Salary is one of the reasons that is often mentioned for a reason why teaching doesn't attract enough people, but also the idea of the stress of the job, of the amount of stuff that goes on outside of the classroom that teachers are required to do. There's a lot of pressure on teachers in a lot of countries, a lot of educational systems that come from society, that come from parents, that come from people who don't really know much about education often, who have their ideas of what teachers should and shouldn't do, etc. There's a lot more understanding of the complexities that teachers need to be aware of for teaching in the classroom, special educational needs, etc. All of this adds up to that. And if a teacher isn't being valued by society, then I think it seems to be the case that where a teacher isn't valued for the work that they do, that's when you have teachers abandoning the profession, and where it's difficult to actually recruit more. But I digress again. Let's go back to plasma teaching in Ethiopia, which was the solution that they decided to adopt. So the idea of getting a television lesson beamed in through satellite to provide, or a recording, to provide a substitution, an alternative to having a live teacher in the classroom. Now, as you can imagine, this, from what I can tell, did not really work. It certainly did not work to a large extent. There seems to be a lot of examples, papers written about what the problems were. Part of the problems that I've read about was that sometimes it was a very top-down solution by all accounts, and sometimes these expensive plasma TVs were sent to schools that did not have electricity and sometimes did not have even running water, and there wasn't any support provided, or not enough support provided in a lot of cases, in a lot of schools. And so when the plasma screens arrived, a lot of them were just put into cupboards and they never were actually used, which is such a shame to have that kind of resource not being made available, or not being made, it wasn't possible to make use of it. Anyway, the other challenges that I've read about are with this type of, not just in Ethiopia, but this type of teaching. So the idea of actually transmission teaching, if you like, is it possible to teach a subject when you're not present in the actual classroom? Well, there are examples of this taking place if there is a two-way means of communication. So if the students are actually able to, if it's happening live, which in a lot of cases in this situation with plasma teaching, it was with the teacher being based in South Africa, then being able to have some kind of feedback from the learners, with the teacher being able to communicate, to see, to observe, to actually have that interaction, that's when it stands a chance, I think, of it being more successful than if it's just transmission teaching. Unfortunately, a lot of the teaching through plasma screens in Ethiopia does seem to have just been transmission teaching. So a teacher just going through their lesson plan and teaching either live or it being recorded and it then being broadcast, if you like, to the students. I think the idea of broadcasting a pre-recorded lesson or part of content does have its place. Educational TV, there's a long history of that being used and certainly being effective. People can learn from this. There's a lot of examples of it, but in this case, there were lots of challenges apart from the what I've already talked about when it comes to not having electricity or running water or other circumstances, local circumstances in some of the schools. But of course, there were the other things such as students with special needs. So plasma lessons were both visual and auditory, but obviously some students with hearing or sight impairments might have been marginalized because of this, and it was very difficult with such large class sizes as well to actually cater to individual students. Student participation, as I mentioned before, this idea of where students are able to respond and react and give feedback and feel that actually what they have to say and how they participate in a lesson counts, makes a big difference, I think. As anyone who's taught any lesson knows, it's this communication that is so important. You can vary your pace as a teacher, etc. You can repeat things that you feel need to be repeated, etc., etc. So this lack of student participation, and in particular, by all accounts, the fast pace of instruction and the lack of time for students to respond, made this type of teaching difficult for students to actively engage in the learning process. Then you have students' needs. The plasma lessons were not designed to address the needs of individual learners. And this is, of course, not just the case of this type of teaching, but any kind of teaching when you have very large class sizes, as I mentioned before, with 55 to 100 students in each of the classes in Ethiopia. It's very difficult to be able to address individual learners, even if you had a teacher in the classroom. Teacher needs as well. I think if you're teaching and you're asked to just be in the classroom and connect to a TV where a teacher in another country and in another context is actually the main person, the main instructor, then this can't be motivating for the teacher. And I have read that in the case in Ethiopia that a lot of teachers did not have a very positive attitude towards this way of teaching. It also feels like it could very much feel like the teacher in the actual classroom is being undermined or not being valued for what they can give. So even if the teacher is perhaps not as qualified or as experienced as the ideal, this isn't going to help that teacher feel or to learn or become a better teacher, is it? To a certain extent, I think. And then you have the curriculum. As with a lot of this type of teaching, I think the plasma lessons tried to cover the national curriculum and was very much top-down and curriculum focused rather than trying to teach the students. It was trying to teach the curriculum, and often at the expense of students' understanding. Then, of course, apart from the lack of, I mentioned the lack of electricity, but of course, if you are going to use technology, then you're going to have a way of dealing with technical issues. And the plasma TV system, the transmission teaching that happened here, often was apparently too fast to understand. It wasn't rewindable. You couldn't repeat it, etc. I think the recordings were transmitted via satellite, etc. And then cost effectiveness. The cost effectiveness of plasma TVs are questionable. Plasma TVs at this point were very new. They were very expensive. They weren't perhaps the best way of addressing the lack of teachers. So as a short to medium term solution for the country, this seems to have had very mixed results. As far as I'm aware, it has been abandoned. It isn't being used any longer. If you know differently, then please come and let me know. It did work in some areas, not so well in others. And in the long term, I think it was decided that the solution really for Ethiopia is to have more teachers and to have teachers that are better trained. I'm going to move on now to another case study, and this is a case study that involves one particular person and two particular projects, and partly designed to address the lack of access to qualified and trained teachers in Ethiopia. There are other solutions that have been adopted to deal with shortages of teachers, and again, the two that I'm going to look at are looking at a macro level. And one of them is called the Hole in the Wall project. I am sure some of you have heard of this already. It is a solution to there being a lack of teachers in many villages in India. And this consists, because I do believe it is still happening, of a learning station, which is a computer with an internet connection embedded in a hole in the wall. And since 1999, and the first computer in New Delhi, where it was installed in a village there, the project has grown to hundreds of computers across India and elsewhere. And the person behind this is Dr. Sugata Mitra. And Mitra took a PC connected to a high-speed data connection and embedded it in a concrete wall, originally next to the wall of his research facility in the south end of New Delhi. It's a bit of an experiment. And he observed what happened. He was interested to know whether, without any kind of introduction, whether this machine that most people in the city did not have access to, what kind of reaction it would get from the people who lived near to his research facility. What he discovered was that a lot of the kids aged 6 to 12 were the ones that started, through their curiosity, I guess, to become more interested in this. And a lot of these kids only had the most rudimentary education and very little knowledge of English, for example, but they took to it. And apparently within days, they taught themselves to draw on the computer and to browse the internet. And the conclusion that Sagata Mitra came to here was that the curiosity takes over when there is an enabling environment where kids in particular can learn on their own. This sparked off a train of thought, the idea of this might be an interesting solution to the problem, the lack of educational facilities within a lot of the villages and towns in India. And it has also found that this type of learning apparently has shown results when it comes to the improvement of English. The idea behind this hole in the wall solution is that groups of children can learn on their own without any direct intervention, without the need for a teacher, which is kind of interesting. Dr. Sagata Mitra calls this MIE, minimally invasive education. And he found that children using these learning stations required little or no input from teachers, and they learn on their own by the process of exploration, discovery, and peer coaching. If you're listening live and have experience of this or have an opinion, have you read about it, you know more than me, because I know not that much about it, but it is something that intrigues me, then please come and join me and we can have a chat about it. Come and join me in the studio. And if you want to know more about how to do that, go to Teachers Talk Radio, ttradio.org, and you can find out how to come and join me live. So that was one solution that was decided upon and implemented and is still happening. There's still a website. It still seems to be in progress and having an effect and giving some kind of educational experience to a lot of children and people in other people, adults included, in villages in the country. And I encourage you to go and learn more by looking it up if you're interested. Another solution, which is also dreamt up by Dr. Sagata Mitra, is something that was quickly labelled the granny cloud, colloquially. And it's an example of using the transformative power of the internet to solve a problem, which also included a lack of teachers. And this came from also looking at what was then new technology, the internet telephony software, such as Skype, and whether it could be used to improve literacy and education. On a trip to India, Mitra asked a group of Indian children what they would like to use this technology for after introducing them to Skype, and was surprised, he said, when they said they wanted British grandmothers to read them fairy tales. And this has been reported in The Guardian, in an article about this in The Guardian. Mitra then started looking for volunteers, and he found about 200 we're going to call them grannies, although they may have been grandfathers as well. Mainly, I think they were female, retired teachers. Not all, but many of them were retired teachers. And they were given the opportunity to read stories across Skype to students in classrooms in India. And the project, which was officially called Soul and Soms, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, SOLE and SOMES. I think those are acronyms. And it is often referred to colloquially as the Granny Cloud. And it has evolved from storytelling to volunteers working as educational mentors to the children. And they are generally available online for about an hour a week for sessions including conversation, storytelling, and singing. And it's all a voluntary program as well. Now, there's no doubt that I think that both of these ideas, the hole in the wall and the Solin Soms, are innovative uses of trying to look at how technology can provide solutions to very difficult problems, such as access to teachers. Do they work? Well, I think the fact, just as the Crazy English method is still being used at the moment, it does seem like both of these ways of providing educational solutions through technology are in existence, and they're still being used, and they're still popular to a certain extent. However, there is a lot of discussion out there on the internet, on blogs, has been for quite some time, and it does sound like some of these projects have certainly been criticised, and there's some controversy or doubt over the effectiveness or the evidence that these projects are working. So I'm not going to say any more about them, but I think if you are interested in knowing more, there's certainly, I think, examples of of innovation in technology being used to try and solve and bridge the digital divide and solve gaps. Whether or not they're as effective as they were hoped to have been is under question, I think, and there is criticism, as I said, out there. So I think I'll leave it to you to actually, if you're interested in knowing more, in going to explore it. Do you have anything else to add to this? Any experience of teaching under difficult circumstances? Come and join me if you're listening live. We can have a chat. I'd love to hear from you. I don't have a guest today, so I'm just going to continue talking about my experience and what I know about the subject. And I would love for any of you out there, if you can, to come and talk to me and add your experience about this. It would certainly add value to the show, I think. So hopefully you can come and join me.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Welcome back. Now moving away from the macro educational system point of view of difficult circumstances and how to address them, and back into the classroom now, I'm going to look at some practical suggestions for teachers who find themselves teaching under relatively difficult circumstances, starting with dealing with large classes, but also moving on to, if you're teaching a language, to how you can deal with multiple levels within the same class, with things like, in general, again, demotivation. How do you deal with students who are demotivated? And what about other things such as lack of resources or social problems? So those are the areas that I have chosen to look at today in the last part of this show. So let's start with dealing with large classes, of course. And though my suggestions will not be valuable if you have huge classes such as the ones I talked about that happened earlier in China. But I do have some suggestions for you if you have large classes. What can you do if you have a large class? Well, an obvious suggestion, I think, is to divide the large class into 2-3 groups. And you can give, as the lesson goes on, each of these groups more attention. You can give more individual attention in part of the lesson to more students if you have this division into groups. Either focus on one half of the class or 1/3 of the class during 1/3 of the class time or one half of the class time, or during one class. You also will get to know them better. Obviously, a lot depends on how many students are in those classes that we have talked about as being large. What do you do then if you divide them into the groups? Well, you can assign practice or review exercises to one group while you teach the other group, etc. Or you can give some thing for the students to do that you would normally do, reading, for example, in silence, that you wouldn't actually be very active as a teacher if you did that with the whole class. Well, you could split the class into 2 or 3 and do that with one half or 2/3 of the class while you actually actively engage with one of the groups. That's one idea. Another idea, which is an extension of this, is something called station work, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. Station work is when you assign pupils to small groups and you give them projects or simple tasks to do together. So you could actually have the physical classroom space, if you're able to do it, with one desk having one activity, another desk having another one, and you assign the students to one of those desks where there is a kind of self-access task, if you like. It could be a reading comprehension, for example, with particular questions for them to look at together. They could have a task where they're meant to actually talk together about a particular thing, come to an agreement about something, to write something together and review it, all sorts of things really, depending on what you wanted to do. So the idea here is that you might have to put in quite a bit of work prior to the class to make sure that the station work tasks are relevant and they work. But then during the actual class time, the students are not working as one large class together, but they're working in pairs, they're working in small groups on particular things. And every so often you have them switch the stations. So you put a timer on, for example, give them 10 minutes, for example, 5, 7, 10 minutes, depending on what you're actually asking them to do, to be able to work on a particular thing. And then once that time has come up, has finished, then you ask them to change. Now, one of the advantages that this allows you to do is that you can either monitor and give support to the students who need additional support. So you can ensure, I think, that the students are on task and that are actually doing what is being provided at the station. You can support 1 or 2 or particular stations if necessary. Or you can actually be a station yourself and get to spend time individually with each of more time with each of the students individually. You get to know them better. What I used to do as a teacher that required to understand as an English teacher, required to understand what level of English students were speaking at, was that I used to do station work when I wanted to actually have some kind of informal evaluation of the students' ability to speak in English. And I used to make notes of the errors that they would make, or how fluent or how accurate they would be, to be able to get a better idea of where each of the students were individually than I would otherwise be able to do if I was trying to do that in addressing them in the whole class. So I found it very, very useful for that, even though in the classes that I'm talking about, they weren't very large. It was still a very useful thing for me to do. What else can you do? Well, you could train all the pupils how to lead a group, and you can actually, when you divide them up into groups, you could give the students a chance to be a group leader. You could choose some of the stronger students to actually teach some of the weaker students certain things. And this is not only a way of being able to deal with large class sizes, but it's a way of actually giving students who are naturally ahead of other students the opportunity to feel that they're learning a new type of skill as well. So I think this is good. You could also make use of the stronger students to help be peer tutors to the weaker students. That's related to what I've just said. So those are some examples of how you can deal with large classes. Now, what about if you're a language teacher and you have students with multiple levels of English or other language in the classroom? Again, station work is very useful for this. If you do station work, for example, you don't have to have all students do all stations. You could have some of the stations specifically targeting students of different levels. So you can have stations that were designed with tasks that are designed for beginners, with other tasks where the students have more challenging materials if their level of the language is higher. And this is a way you don't have to have them on separate desks, for example. You can have the same task and the students could choose which of the tasks on the station to do based on how confident they were about their language level. If you have, with languages, if you have access to headphones and recording devices, you can have them actually do some speaking, record their speaking or listen to some of the language as well in those stations. There's all sorts of things you can do which are worth experimenting with. And you then, as I said before, change the group once in a while, every 5-10 minutes, depending on what you have them to do. You can also have student tutors. You can get the strongest students of a language to teach the weakest ones if you have a particular difference between them. And another thing you can do, of course, is you have extra material or tasks available for those fast finishers. You can also give the students who are weaker the materials in advance that you're going to be using in the classroom. You could give them additional materials that support. For example, they could translate some of the instructions in their own language. Is one way of doing that. Okay, what about demotivation? That's another thing I mentioned at the beginning of the show. What can you do if you have students who are very demotivated? This is one of the things that I've found is very challenging, particularly if you have a class of students who are mixed, that some of them are motivated, some of them are demotivated. It's very difficult to know how to address that. I think it's easier if you have a whole group of students, a whole class who, well, it's obviously easier if they're all motivated, but if they're all demotivated for some reason, if they all don't want to be there, then you can start to kind of understand why that is the case. Do they not find what they're studying relevant? How can you address that? Can you make it more interesting for them? Can you bring something in that they're interested in that will help them, that will lead them to be interested in the actual subject, etc., or the topic that you're doing? That is easier than if you have just some of the students demotivated, etc. I think how can you address this? In my experience, I think one of the things you have to do is get to know your students. What are they like? What are they not like? Who are they as people? Why? You need to do what you can to try and understand what it is about what you're teaching that they're not interested in it? Is there a way that you can change their mind? Can you use examples or material that is relevant to their lives? A lot of demotivation, again, in my experience, comes from the fact that the students might not think that. They might think that they're wasting their time, that this isn't relevant to what they want to do or the people that they are in the classroom, and trying to change that viewpoint, that attitude, could make a huge difference. If you can address them as individuals, if you can show that you know them as as individuals, that you know who they are, what they like, etc., then that can make a big difference. Rather than if you're just sort of trying to teach from a book or from the curriculum without really trying to address their individual contexts and interests. So that's definitely the thing that I find that makes the most difference. You can also be a good example. So in other words, if you're one of the little things that I used to do is I used to always turn up to class with a book. I wanted to encourage reading, and I didn't used to make a big thing of it, but I just always used to turn up to class with a book, have a book on me, it would be there, and then usually there would be some student in the class who was curious enough to ask about the book and have an opportunity. That way they know that I'm someone who reads, someone who's interested in that. And so if I'm asking them to read, if I'm trying to encourage them, as it was in the example that I'm using, to actually add reading as a subject, as something that they do as a matter of course outside of class, not even reading in my example in English, but reading in general as a good thing for them to do, then if I'm being a role model without being kind of like obviously so, then it's more likely to have an effect than if they never see me with a book, for example. So that was something. So if you can be a role model to your students, I think this is so important. To be a good example. Of course, one of the best things you can do is get feedback from the people you're teaching, from the students, about what you're doing in class. Whenever you do something new, or you can get this feedback either by asking directly, so give them a little survey to fill in about something that you've done, so they can fill it in anonymously if you think they're likely to be more honest that way, or just ask them. Or you can actually take note of the way that they react to particular activities or things that you do and adjust what you're teaching based on that as well. So are they smiling? Are they happy? Are they enthusiastic? Are they bored? Are they restless? Are they not interested? And you can adjust things like that. That's an obvious way that you can do thing that you can do as you go along as you're teaching. And then again, giving more choice and autonomy to the learners that you're teaching, if you will definitely help. If you can help them to become more autonomous learners, if you can help them to become more interested, whatever strategy you end up adopting in what they're learning, that will obviously help. So that's demotivation. Another common complaint is lack of resources. How can you deal with lack of resources? Well, if you are, for example, an example is technology, lack of technology in the classroom. Well, station work, you can make the one computer that you have in the classroom part of the station. So if you think about how you can share the limited resources in innovative ways, I think that helps. You can make more use of human resources. With technology as well, I think the idea of trying to use this idea of bring your own device, if you're able to do that, if your school allows you, you can use what the students have, so long as you are aware of not drawing attention to the students who don't have devices. And if that is going to make them react in negative ways, then you have to be careful with that. The human resource thing is interesting. You have people in the room. Make use of the people in the room. They all have stories. They all have backgrounds. They all have things that they can teach each other. They all know things. So it's not just about the teacher teaching the students. It's about the students teaching each other, etc. So making more use of those human resources is always a good thing as well. You could get students to make resources. So students, you can make an activity for students to actually make resources such as flashcards, little books, etc., texts, and reuse these either within the same class or within other classes. You can find opportunities for students to learn during their everyday lives. So what do they have access to at home? Is there something that they can do at home that they would normally do? Examples are TV or computer games, for example, that there may be opportunities, certainly for language learning. A lot of the options for those kinds of entertainment things are to watch things with subtitles on rather than dubbed into languages, which is something that teachers should definitely make use of. And you can try and look at what you have, look at the limited resources, and try to find out if there are imaginative or inventive ways of using them. It's hard to generalize there. Next is social problems. What can you do? It's very difficult to generalize here, but I think it all comes back to knowing your students. So if you know the context of your students, where they live, who they are, their background, what kind of difficulties they may be facing in their regular lives outside of school, then this will help. Being empathetic, being understanding, being knowledgeable about the context, your students, and what they may be facing is so important, because then you can either adapt the way that you teach or what you're asking them to do based on that, based on what's happening within the community or individuals, if you have the knowledge, etc. And you can do that through head teachers, school leaders, and also just being out and about within the community, getting to know parents, getting to know people who are there, keeping up with local news, but also just asking your students, having conversations with the students and finding out from them what's happening, I think is so important. And then after that, I think making your class to be the safe and fun place to be, making sure that the students feel that when they're in the school, when they're in the class, that this is a safe space, that this is a place where they can come and not only learn but enjoy themselves. To be is important. You showing understanding and consideration is related to what I've just said as well. And then other more general advice, well, apart from knowing your students well, I think if you can establish a good rapport with the students, communicate and give feedback frequently, you can show concern for all the students, so not just the strong ones or the weak ones. I think you need to teach and show concern to each of the individual students as much as you can, of course, depending on how large your classes are. But if you can keep that in mind, I think it will help. Arousing the students' interests, or doing things that you know that the students will respond to well because they're interested in it. If it's music or famous people that they may be interested in, or anything really, just sort of getting to know what the students are interested in and bringing those examples into the class to some extent will help. Creating a safe, friendly atmosphere in your class, as I mentioned before, managing the students, regrouping them in different ways, keeping the class disciplined by establishing standards that are adhered to, so that will keep everybody safe, and so minimize the time wasted as well, I think is so important. Promoting learner autonomy, and finally, smiling, actually showing that you're, I know it can be difficult, but it's a bit like if you're an actor, you can't, I think, let your, or as much as possible, you can't let the way that you feel about things that are going on affect the way that you are in front of the students. As much as you can change that. So if you're able to smile, and not a false smile as well, I think it's important to try your best to try and actually enjoy your time in the classroom. Make it a place where you are seen, that you feel not even having fun. I think it's more about you feel that you being there is worth it. So you feel that your time in that classroom with that group of people is a good use of time. If you feel that, if you're able to make yourself feel that, then that will come across, I think, and it will make all the difference. If you feel that you're giving this group of people the kind of attention that they should have, that you feel that this is important for you, for them to be there with you, that for them to be learning what you are teaching, then it can make all the difference. These are all difficult things to do all of the time, but I think it's certainly something you should have in mind and try to aspire to do. And that, I think, brings me to the end of the show. I'm all talked out, I think. Unfortunately, nobody came to join me to have a chat. If you're listening to the recording, then please come along and listen to the show live. And I'd love to have more people than actually do. I've had a few people join me live on some shows, usually at the end if I have a guest. But on this particular type of show, where I decide to do something on my own, either because a guest drops out or it's not possible, or just for a change of format, then I'd love to hear from someone rather than just have the whole show with me talking. So please come along and do that. I would love to hear from you.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
According to Schools Week, all three of Eton College's proposed flagship Elite Sixth Forms, run in partnership with Star Academies, which were to level up left-behind areas, are being reviewed by the government. All three of the 16 to 19 schools due to open in Dudley, Teesside and Oldham are part of a review of whether 44 planned mainstream free schools offer value for money. The government has so far refused to confirm which of the projects are affected. The three schools were originally given the green light last summer and were described as high-quality, academic-focused 16 to 19 free schools in education investment areas. The plans were part of the former government's Levelling Up white paper. An Eton Star Partnership spokesperson said, "The review does not come as a huge surprise given the current fiscal situation, and we intend to fully engage with this process," but that it remained fully committed to the plans, saying it would transform the lives of many young people across the country. The Department for Education said assessments will be based on whether the proposed schools meet a need for places in the area, if they have any impact on existing local providers, and whether the schools would provide a distinctive curriculum. In The Guardian, a report covers comments by Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson about schools' focus on well-being. Speaking at the CST conference, she suggested that schools can respond to declining attendance and an increase in numbers of pupils with SEND by improving the sense of belonging. She said, "Exam results open important doors to opportunity for young people. They will continue to be the anchor of our education system. But A-stars alone do not set young people up for a healthy and happy life. And where previous governments have had tunnel vision, we will widen our ambition." This speech came in the context of a wide-ranging curriculum and assessment review, as well as plans for a Children's Wellbeing Bill to be published next year. Phillipson went on to say that well-being and belonging hold the key. If we want to tackle the epidemic of school absence, children need to feel like they belong in school. She also argued that a sole focus on achieving is doomed to fail, because if we fall into that trap of chasing a narrow shade of standards, then children with SEND get swept to the side and attendance crashes. The curriculum review is expected to encourage a broader curriculum to be taught in schools, including music, art, sport and drama, as well as vocational subjects. FE Week reports on information from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which suggests government should replace GCSE maths resits with a new foundation level course, after warning the bar is unachievably high for some students to pass the GCSE. In the report, it says research found England's share of young people studying maths up to the age of 18 is among the lowest in the OECD's 38 member countries, in part due to a limited range of options for continuing the subject in post-16 settings. The study found that at least half of students study maths to 18 across OECD member countries, compared with just 16.5% of students in England, and a third of those were those who did not have a grade 4 at GCSE. The report suggests that the breadth and depth of maths GCSE is comparable to other programmes across the OECD, but that England students are younger when they take the course and have just 2 years to cover content compared to 4 in other countries. The report finally recommended that policymakers review and consider a foundation-level course for those who do not achieve a grade 4 at GCSE, to ensure that they can continue their core mathematical knowledge and skills, replacing the GCSE resit altogether. Finally, the BBC reports that a 17-year-old Chinese maths prodigy actually cheated in a maths contest, according to its organisers. The student made headlines in June when she came 12th in the qualifiers for the contest run by the e-commerce company Alibaba. She was the first finalist since 2018 to have come from a vocational school, as the vast majority of past finalists have come from elite universities. However, competition organisers said the student had violated competition rules by receiving help from her teacher, who was also a contestant. The story has prompted debate about whether China's education system does enough to support gifted students in less academic pathways, as well as the pressures all students and teachers face. Full details can be found on the BBC News Asia webpage. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
So that brings us to the end of today's Sunday lunchtime show. Many thanks to all of you who joined us live and to those listening back to the recording. And so that's it from me. There are Teachers Talk radio shows all week on all manner of interesting topics, so please listen in live or back to the recordings. And I hope you will join me again next week at the same time when I will have a guest. Bye for now.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.